Hello, welcome back to the Journal of Mormon Polygamy podcast, the JMP or Jump podcast, where we jump into the articles with the author. Today, a special guest is Todd Compton with his newly published article, Manifestos and Ambiguity, Joseph Hyrum Grant and Plural Marriage. It's really great to have you here today, Todd, and I would like to introduce you to the audience. I think most people know who you are, but we'll go ahead and introduce you anyway. So Todd Compton is an American historian and classicist, best known for his influential work on early Mormon plural marriage. He earned a master's degree from Brigham Young University and a PhD in classics from UCLA, where he specialized in Greek and Indo-European mythology. He taught at USC, at UCLA, and California State University, Northridge. Compton's groundbreaking book, In Sacred Loneliness, The Plural Wives of Joseph Smith, from 1997, received top awards from both Mormon History Association and the John Whitmer Historical Association. And this established Todd as a leading authority on the subject. So we're very happy to have him here. The Mormon History Association also honored him with the 2002 Best Documentary Award for A Widow's Tale, the 1884 to 1886 Diary of Helen Mar Kimball Whitney, co-edited with Charles Hatch, and the 1996 Award of Excellence for his article, A Trajectory of Plurality, an overview of Joseph Smith's 33 plural wives. He has also recently published the documents concerning his In Sacred Loneliness book. He's received many other awards in Mormon history and for other articles that he has written. Thank you for joining us today, Todd. It's good to have you here. To start off on your article, Manifestos and Ambiguity, Joseph Hyrum Grant and Plural Marriage, could you just briefly tell us what the main theme is of your article?
Well, I document Joseph Hyrum Grant's involvement with post-Manifesto polygamy, post-first Manifesto and post-second Manifesto. And he did marry a plural wife in 1892 himself. And then some of the members of his stake, he was stake president in Bountiful. It was called the Davis stake. Some of the members in his stake were involved with polygamy. And so he is my great-grandfather, and I didn't know about any of this until one day I was reading through the appendix of Carmen Hardy's Solemn Covenant, and usually you don't read through appendices, they're just there for reference, but I was just reading through it for no good reason, and there was a name that looked familiar, and I didn't know much about my ancestors, but the name looked familiar, Joseph Hyrum Grant, so I looked it up, and it was him. And so since then, I've slowly done a little bit of research, but lately I've done some serious research on that, especially that first plural marriage.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So that's a little bit about how you came to write on the topic. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your connection, your family history connection, because I thought that was really interesting. And you talked about that in your addendum. Could you tell us a little bit more about your connection through family history to this subject of this article?
Well, I mean, he is part of our family history. He's a great-grandfather. And so I had an aunt who knew him, and unfortunately, she's passed away. And when I was a young kid, I wasn't interested in this subject. So, but I found out from my cousin that and some things she's written that, she called him a jolly man who sang songs to her. She loved him. And so that was kind of startling to me. Like, here's a subject I'm writing about, and he's someone who's almost alive. There's just one step between us. It was very, very interesting and very odd. Um, so, and my grandmother was his daughter, and I knew my grandmother when I
Mm-hmm.
was a kid before she passed away. So I wish I was asking all of these questions when I was 5 years old, but I wasn't.
Absolutely right.
Um, so, and I've never researched my own ancestors, so that was a change for me. And so that was a lot of fun. And in other ways, it's kind of challenging.
Hmm.
Um,
Right.
so
No, I think that's fascinating. We think of polygamy as being so far back in our history, and it's just so interesting to see how close it really is.
and
So,
especially post-manifesto polygamy is
yeah,
really
right.
late, like we're
True.
talking about some of it is in the 20th century, the 1900 to 1904, and then after the second manifesto,
Hmm. Right.
the decade after that. So it isn't even 19th century anymore. So,
Right.
um, and I'd always been fascinated by post-manifesto polygamy. I'd always read the works by Mike Quinn and Carmen Hardy with great fascination, and got to know them,
Hmm.
and never thought to ask them about my great grandfather, though.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
they've unfortunately passed away too.
It is a
Um,
really fascinating topic, and I know I learned a lot from reading your paper as well. So,
uh-huh.
back to Joseph Hyrum Grant, could you tell us your great grandfather? Could you tell us a little bit more about his early life and background?
Well, his father was Jedediah Morgan Grant, who was a counselor in the first presidency. And he was the son of basically the woman who acted as the first wife in the family. So he grew up in polygamy. And his younger brother was Heber J. Grant, who was a son of the last wife in the family. And so he grew up in Bountiful and was very skilled with horses, loved horses and farming. And so um, he became a bishop in that area, south, kind of southwest Bountiful. It was called Woods Cross. And he became a bishop, and then he became a counselor in the stake presidency, and then later he was a member of the stake presidency. So that's just a little, overview of his life. Um,
Yeah, and then he married Eliza Eveletta Eldridge. Could you tell us a little bit about that marriage and that relationship? His
so
first.
again, that's my great grandmother.
Uh-huh.
And so she was the daughter of General Authority Horace Eldridge, who was a 70, but he was also um, very much into business and finances. He was one of the founders of Zions Bank. And um, so Eliza Eveletta married Joseph Hyrum, and they had a big family, like 10 kids. And my grandmother was one of the older kids. And so there's a picture of her in our book. She was a remarkable woman too. And all of the kids were great. Like my mother knew all of these kids of Joseph Hyrum Grant and would tell me stories about them. And when I told her that Joseph Hyrum Grant married a plural wife, she was like, "Oh, I didn't know that." So I found documentation just in family history as well as other places, but no one really, it didn't sink in really um, when we were talking about Joseph Hyrum Grant. Uh,
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, if you could tell us a little bit more about first, just a little bit more about the circumstances of his second marriage with Louisa Coltrane, and then we can talk about all of that documentation that you found, not all of it, but a lot, some of that documentation.
mhm, mhm.
So,
Well, one of his close friends was Ether Coltrane,
Hmm.
a man named Ether Coltrane, and he was kind of an inactive Mormon, quasi-inactive. I think his family was more active. And but he loved horses like Joseph Hyrum Grant, and they loved horse racing. And there's some hints of gambling in that horse racing history with those two people. But they were close friends and did a lot of things together. And Joseph Hyrum in the church would do things for the Coltrane family. Like he helped one of the sons get a mission call to Scotland instead of the southern states. So he pulled some strings with Joseph F. Smith, and um, this son got to go to Scotland, where I think his ancestors were. Because Joseph Hyrum was helping him out, helping the family out. He would give them blessings and things like that. So uh, Ether died in 1892. Ether Coltrane died. Um, I don't have the death date here, it's in my paper. But 2 months later, Joseph Hyrum and Louisa Coltrane got married in the Logan Temple. And it was a proxy marriage, which means that um, Joseph Hyrum stood proxy for Ether Coltrane as Louisa was married to Ether for eternity. And then he and Louisa were married for time, which is a standard way proxy marriages work in our church. And I don't know if they still do it that way, but back then, if it was a proxy marriage, the man who stood proxy um, got married for time to the woman. And that happened with Heber J. Grant's um, parent, his mother. What was her name? Rachel Ivins. She got married to Joseph Smith for eternity, and then married to Jedediah Morgan Grant for time. And so the children always go to the eternal marriage. So Heber J. Grant felt that he was linked to Joseph Smith, not to Jedediah Morgan Grant for eternity.
Right.
So
Now, in
anyway,
his case with Joseph Hyrum Grant, he was still married to Eliza when he married Louisa for time.
yeah,
So that wouldn't be happening today, right? That wouldn't be happening today, but it did happen
I
then.
don't know. I don't know how they would. I guess they wouldn't do that now. I hadn't thought about that right now till you mentioned it. At least, if there was a living first wife, I guess they wouldn't do it that way. Um, so, um, I have a friend who works at the LA Temple, and I thought I've got to ask him about this. So I still need to do that. But, of course, historians, all we need to know is about what happened, in the 19th century. We don't care about what's happening now. But so anyway, so he married her just 2 months after the death of Ether. And I think there was this feeling that they needed to do the temple work, all the temple work they could for Ether.
Mhm.
And the person who performed the marriage was Mariner Merrill, who was an apostle and also the president of the Logan Temple. And he was very much involved in post-Manifesto polygamy, and he married a plural wife himself after the Manifesto. So, um,
Yeah, so it's really interesting because you go through some of the items that document how you know that this wasn't just a ceremony, but that he actually, took her on as a plural wife, right?
yeah, and I found lots of documentation for that. And I won't go into all of it, but like in the local paper, I think it's the Davis County Clipper. Eliza Eveletta died in 1811, and Joseph Hyrum Grant, when did he die? Maybe like 1817, something like that. But when he died, the paper said, "Oh yes, he's survived by his plural wife, his wife Louisa." So it was very well known that he was married to Louisa Coltrane. And
Right.
also on his death certificate, Louisa is the witness who gives information. So it was no secret in the Bountiful area. And
Right.
uh,
Yeah, he died in 1917, Joseph Hyrum Grant.
1917, yeah. Hmm.
And yeah, Eliza died in 1911.
Yeah.
So yeah, so they had that. There were some other, I don't know if you can mention a few of the other interesting documents that you found that show that they were living as married.
Well, I I just started looking at when I was actually doing real research, I looked at Family Search on for Louisa Coltrane, and there was a descendant of Louisa and Ether who was very interested in documenting that she married Joseph Hyrum Grant, and so he had 3 letters by Heber J. Grant that he wrote to Louisa after Joseph Hyrum's death. And they were all sent to, he started them out saying, um, Dear Louisa Grant, you know. So he knew that
Oh,
she
okay,
was
so I was
married.
saying Louisa, but it's actually Louisa.
I don't know.
Okay.
People there's also a Louisa Beeman in the Joseph Smith Plural Wives, and I've never been sure how to say it. So
Yeah,
don't
so
quote me on that. I
that's
hope no one's
actually
listening to this.
that's actually really interesting too that Heber J. Grant, wrote those letters to Louisa or Louisa. Um, because he was at the time he wasn't the president quite yet, right? But he was an apostle,
It was still
and
impossible.
and
Yeah.
he knew that that was a plural marriage, even though it was post-Manifesto.
So when did he become president? When did Joseph F. die? See,
Um,
this is the difference between me speaking off the cuff and me writing, because I just looked up. Was it 1918 that,
1918 or something like so. It's right after that. I looked it up the other day. It was either
yeah,
18 or 19. It was
that's when
right
he
after.
became president. That's when Heber J. Grant became president.
Right. Hmm.
Yeah. So it wasn't that far away, but from when he wrote those letters to Louisa.
Right. Right. It's very
Yeah.
interesting. And I think, I don't know if you wanted to mention it later, but you might as well mention it now since you brought up Heber J. Grant. What's his relation to Joseph Hyrum Grant?
He was a younger brother from a different plural wife.
Yeah, so
Um,
he was a half brother, right?
right. So you read Joseph, though um, Spencer W. Kimball would say, "Oh, we don't count halves. We don't divide people in half. He's my brother."
Mhm, mhm,
So you read the Heber C. Grant diaries, and every now and then he talks about Hiram, and they would call Joseph Hiram. They just call him Hiram,
mhm,
and so he was his brother, so he'd mention him every now and then, and
mhm,
Joseph Hiram was the older brother, so he looked up to him as an older brother.
mhm.
And so it's interesting especially with the second manifesto part of my paper, to see how Heber J. Grant fits in.
Right.
And because Heber J. Grant was one of the investigating apostles on the Lyman Committee. And so people in Joseph Hyrum Grant's stake came to these 3 apostles to be investigated, one of whom was Heber J. Grant. And Joseph Hyrum was the stake president, so they'd want him there too.
Yeah.
So
So we'll get to that in just a second. But in your
yeah,
paper, you talk about, I think it's about six, yeah, about six of those different documentation for that marriage. But we'll move on and we'll let the readers read your paper. Please go to journalofmormonpolygamy.org and you can read the paper because he goes into a lot of details about that documentation. But we're going to move to the second part of the paper, the part where Joseph Hyrum Grant is connected to post Second Manifesto polygamy. So can you talk about what his connection is to that?
well, mainly through one of the patriarchs in his stake named Judson Tolman. And um, I could talk about him at length. We're supposed to be doing 20 minutes, aren't we?
Yeah, so yeah, we're just a short podcast.
So I won't talk about him at length, but he started doing plural marriages. And this is after 1904. It was, which is when the second manifesto happened. And part of the second manifesto, but from Joseph F. Smith, was that it kind of promised excommunication. It's saying, okay, there will be excommunications with, if people aren't keeping this, because with the first manifesto, um, most of those marriages were authorized by the first presidency and or apostles. So they were generally authorized by church leaders. And, and every the history of each case is different. So it's kind of hard to make total generalizations like that. But they were, on the whole, I think they were authorized by first presidency and apostles, and like
So for
Mariner
those who
Merrill
might
for
be
Joseph Hyrum
confused,
Grant.
because some people might be new to the topic, but after the 1890 manifesto, what you're saying is that there were still some plural marriage. The 1890 manifesto was supposed to put an end to plural marriage, but there
Right.
were plural marriages that took place after that, and you're saying that most of those were authorized by either the first presidency or apostles and other church leaders.
Yes. And there's lots of excuses, like conservative Mormons give for what was happening and with those post-manifesto marriages. And the excuses don't hold water when you look at, them in detail, but we can't give the whole story of post-manifesto polygamy in
Right,
20
right.
minutes, or now it's only 5 minutes.
Well, we
Um,
can go a little over. But so then in 1904 though, they issued a second one and said we're going to excommunicate is what you said. And then
yeah,
what did
and
you
it kind
find?
of repeated what was said in the first manifesto, but it did add this paragraph about, you know, we're going to use excommunication discipline.
Mhm.
And so Mike Quinn talked about the manifesto was born
Oh,
in
yeah.
ambiguity, existed in ambiguity, and produced ambiguity. And um, and it's even more true of marriages after the second manifesto, because some people believed, and during the time, different church members believed different things, and
Mhm.
it's hard to generalize even about church leaders. But some members believed after the second manifesto there were no authorized plural marriages, and anyone who was involved would be excommunicated. So um, that was partially true. And in the little case history we have of Judson Tolman and in the Joseph Hyrum Grant story, um, Judson Tolman was brought to be examined by the Lyman Committee, which included Heber J. Grant, and he gave um, testimony that was not true, which is different than how things were with the first manifesto, where, the apostles actually encouraged people to get married um, in plurality. And so he was immediately excommunicated, Judson Tolman. And but he had married and involved in the marriage ceremonies with two people who were closely connected with Joseph Hyrum Grant, and one was Joseph Hyrum's bishop, Daniel Muir. And Daniel Muir actually performed two marriages for Judson Tolman when he married two plural wives. This is all after 1904. And the other one who got married after 1906 was a member of the first of the stake presidency, James Eldridge, the first counselor to Joseph Hyrum. And um, and he was half brother, you know, or since we don't split people in half, a brother of Eliza Eveletta Eldridge, Joseph Hyrum's wife. And so after when James Eldridge saw what was going to happen, that Judson Tolman was going to be excommunicated, he went right to Salt Lake City to the meeting of the apostles and said, okay, I was involved. I got married after the second manifesto. Um, and they said, okay, repent, don't do it again, and send him back to Davis County. And he continued as the counselor in the stake presidency and as a good member of the church.
Mhm.
And even though he married and confessed to marrying a woman after the second manifesto. So there's that ambiguity there with the second manifesto.
Right, where
And
some were
at least as
excommunicated
far
and
as,
some weren't.
right.
Mhm.
And the same thing with Daniel Muir. He both married a plural wife after the second manifesto and performed two marriages, plural marriages after the manifesto. And they told him that he would not be excommunicated. And he was um, he was examined after he had been released as bishop.
Mhm.
Um,
And in telling some of this story, you bring in the Reed Smoot diary and some of Heber J. Grant's diaries and other things. It's very interesting. Um,
yeah,
so to be clear to the people who are listening, Joseph Hyrum Grant himself did not have a post-Second Manifesto marriage, right? But
right,
he had a post-Manifesto marriage, but not a post-Second Manifesto marriage. And but he was connected because he was the stake president of the
right.
patriarch who was engaging in it, of his counselor who was
Well,
engaging,
and
and the bishop, right, who was engaging.
Judson Tolman felt that Joseph Hyrum had given him permission.
Hmm.
So the apostles, in their room in Salt Lake City, asked Joseph Hyrum, and he said no, he denied it. And I think what happened was they were working through hinting at things.
Hmm.
And so Judson Tolman might have felt that Joseph Hyrum was hinting that it would be okay, and Joseph Hyrum didn't feel like he was doing anything like that. But again, that's ambiguity.
Hmm.
And by the way, I made the point um, that relates to Nauvoo polygamy, that if these plural marriages are ambiguous, the documentation for them often is ambiguous. And so often there's conflicting testimony. You get testimony from descendants, and so testimony might conflict or it might have the dates wrong and so but because these are secret marriages, they're not publicly documented in the newspaper, you don't have full, you know, full documentation like you do for a legal marriage.
Hmm. And I really
So the
appreciate.
marriages in Nauvoo were illegal and these marriages were illegal, and so they had to be secret, and so it's a challenge for historians to document them
Hmm.
because of that ambiguity.
And I really appreciated you pointing that out in your as a historian, that that there is a lot of ambiguity, that you can have conflicting testimony, like you said. Just Judson Tolman said that Joseph Hyrum Grant gave him authorization to conduct those marriages and be in those marriages. Joseph Hyrum Grant said he hadn't. And as a historian, it's really hard to know who's telling the truth or if the truth is somewhere in between, like you said. And so, I think it's good to be able to point that out to say, look, these are the conflicting testimonies. We can't say with all 100% certainty which one's telling, the truth.
Uh-huh. In a case like Joseph Hyrum Grant, I think it's virtually certain that he was, that marriage to
Oh
to
yeah.
Louisa took place.
Right. Yes. Right.
Um, with the marriages with Judson Tolman, it's there's more ambiguity going on there.
Hmm. Hmm. Right. More ambiguity as to how much was authorized by
Yeah,
Justin.
but we have some of these wonderful diaries by people like Reed Smoot, Heber J. Grant that talk about these trials. Um, and so it's wonderful to have that testimony by
Hmm.
Smoot and Joseph Hyrum Grant and others, Anthony Ivins. There's some really valuable and helpful documents that support, this whole story.
Yes, definitely. So, you talked a little bit about the Lyman Committee. That was interesting. What should we, as the readers, take away from the article?
Well, when I started researching Joseph Hyrum Grant, one takeaway is when you start researching something, you never know where it's going to lead. And you you've got to follow the evidence and try to figure out what's going on. And so when I started researching Joseph Hyrum Grant, I knew from the appendix to uh, Solemn Covenant by Carmen Hardy, I knew that at least one person said that he had been that he had married Louisa Coltrane after the Manifesto. And later I found other evidence. Um, but I didn't know anything, I've never really looked at Second Manifesto things. And, like Mike Quinn's big article ends before the Second Manifesto. Um, Carmen Hardy's book does include some post-Manifesto stuff, but there's not much there. He kind of really focuses on the first Manifesto period. And so it was really, if you're a researcher, you never know where you're, where the evidence is going to take you. So it took
Right.
me into the second manifesto and the ambiguity of the second manifesto and the marriages after. So that's one thing. That's one takeaway. Another thing is you can you can start out on so like so Joseph Hyrum Grant. I'll tell you one little story which shows what researching is like. Um, so in that appendix by Carmen Hardy, it has it has equivalent to footnotes. It has documentation. They're not actual footnotes, but it has documentation right there. And gave a letter written by someone in Star Valley, Wyoming, where he openly stated that Joseph Hyrum had married Louisa Coltrane. And so great. And it said it was part of the certain Smith papers in the Marriott Library at U of U.
Hmm.
So I went to the University of Utah and asked for that letter and said, here it is right here in Solemn Covenant. And so the researcher, who was a very fine historian in his own right, um, went back behind the scenes, and I waited and waited, and he came back and he said, "I'm really sorry, we can't find that.
Hmm.
We don't know where that letter is."
Oh, wow.
And so I was like, okay. So as far as actually proving what Carmen Hardy said, I didn't have the actual proof he cited. And I trust Carmen Hardy. And so I tried to track down that letter in other ways and never was able to do it. And then later, when I started researching Joseph Hyrum again, and actually when I was starting researching for this article that I knew would be published, I just thought, well, I'll check with um, University of Utah again and see if it showed up. And so I sent them a letter and I said, they couldn't find this before. Is it still missing? And one of the women there really looked hard for it and found it.
It's
Made a
amazing.
copy of it and sent it to me.
Yeah.
And so that was really wonderful that I got that letter, even though I'd found lots of evidence before that,
Hmm.
from like the letters of Heber J. Grant to Louisa Grant and things like that. And let's see, I was making a point with this, and now I was telling the story and I've forgotten the point. Do you remember what the point was?
It
I was saying you never know where
the
research is going to lead you.
takeaways, you said that you couldn't ever know where it's leading, and then you said another takeaway is, but you didn't state what it was. Maybe if you keep searching, you might find
Yeah,
things that
and
haven't been found in the past. That's
yep,
something I
I
learned.
had a good point, but you'll have to hear the story and enjoy the story and see if the audience can figure out the point of that.
Well,
But
I think it's really interesting because you have, this paper is just a case study of Joseph Hyrum Grant. And of course, that's not the entire story of post-Manifesto polygamy or post-Second Manifesto polygamy. I mean, there's way, way more, but you still learn a lot from this case study. You learn quite a bit. And so
mhm,
if we did lots of case studies, we would learn more and more. And some people have done some
yeah,
things already, but
yeah,
but you can go down so many rabbit holes. There's just endless things to research to find out more. So I think that's really,
yeah. And if there's you know, any researchers listening to this who are looking for a subject to write about, there's a lot we could still do on post-manifesto polygamy. And I've done a lot of biography, both short biographies and longer biographies. And I found out that's really a good way to look at a certain subject. And so I was just thinking, we don't have a book of, like 20 case studies of post-manifesto polygamy.
mhm.
We do have some books that look at, they're kind of like biographies. Um, and there's a really great book on John Taylor. It was done by the guy who lived right here I'm in Northern California, who lived in Redwood City, Sam Taylor.
Oh, uh-huh.
So, Family Kingdom. So I highly recommend that. So he wrote a whole book about his grandfather. And so obviously you could write whole books that are biographies, but you could also write a really interesting book of 10 case studies of post-manifesto polygamy.
Hmm.
You know,
And you
yeah.
just barely briefly mentioned in the article that in 1933, there was what many call the Third Manifesto, which really, really, truly
Mhm.
finally put an end to polygamy in the church. And, Heber J. Grant was the president at that time. And so you have mentioned that it would be interesting to do a deeper study of Heber J. Grant and how because he had been a polygamist and then he wasn't when he was president because he had three wives and two of them had died. So when he was president, he only had one living wife. And he had become, by then, very anti-polygamy. And so you said that it would be interesting to study exactly how that trajectory happened in his life.
Yeah, and Ron Walker was writing a biography of Heber J. Grant, and he actually published kind of a quasi biography, which is a lot of articles he'd published. But it's really a fine book. But too bad that he passed away. It would have been really great to see how he dealt with some of those issues. And, like I've never felt like it was my job or my mission to write about post-manifesto polygamy. So I kind of got dragged into this kind of willingly by some of my friends. And so like lately I've been writing on Navajo history, a Navajo biography, and have been focused on that. But we really do need a good biography of Heber J. Grant and to see this transition, and one that doesn't ignore his involvement in polygamy.
Hmm.
Because we do have some biographies that just are well documented in some ways and then kind of ignore the issue in other ways, ignore post-manifesto polygamy. It's
Hmm.
like the writers aren't interested in it. and it's important and interesting.
I
We
was just
really
gonna
do
say,
need a full biography of Heber J. Grant.
yeah,
And I could tell you some family stories about him too, but we'll stick with Joseph Hyrum now.
that's great. No, I really enjoyed your paper. And before we conclude, is there anything else you want to say? Anything else we didn't mention, or any concluding remarks?
No, I could say something like how much I owe to Mike Quinn and Carmen Hardy, and I got to know both of them, and great people, both of them, great scholars, and both helped me with my In Sacred Loneliness project. And so thanks to them, I was really building on their work in this Joseph Hyrum Grant paper.
Great.
Um,
Well, we really appreciate you coming on today and talking more about your article. I really would like to invite all of the readers to go to journalofmormonpolygamy.org in order to read his full paper with all of the documentation. He's got some great pictures as well, and links to a lot of these letters and items from Family Search and other things, and it's really great, interesting read. So thank you for joining us, Todd, and we look forward to everyone reading your paper.
okay, thank you. Thanks for the good questions, Tiani.
You're welcome.